makes me a little nervous. As Kim mentioned, I previously worked at the archives. I probably hold the record for shortest tenure assistant director of the archives. So I hope you'll forgive me for that, but I am working on a project in Walkerville with my friend Daniel Hogan, who's here, and have had a lot more time to realize that dream, which has been good. Although I definitely miss working here and hanging out with all the other staff, which are all wonderful. And this presentation today is basically something I put together kind of in spare time while I was working here. And
wait, you had spare time?
Spare time sometimes, yeah. But it kind of goes back to when I first started working here. I was talking with Dick Gibson over a beer at the quarry probably, and was asking him, you know, how he puts together so much research for so many years, and he has such a sustained column in the newspaper. And he was basically telling me that, you know, he opens the newspaper and sometimes he's looking for one thing and he just happens across other, maybe more interesting stories just by chance. And so that's really what this presentation, how I put it together, was, you know, patrons would come in, make a research request, I'd be assisting them in finding genealogical information or some kind of research about Butte. And in the course of doing that, usually on the same page in the newspaper, there would be this other article that I would just kind of save and set aside. And then when I had time, go back and look into them a little further. It was also kind of part of my training using the materials that we have at the vault here in the archives. So I would go look up coroner's inquests or judicial court records or district court records, and these little leads that seemed like tantalizing, lurid crime stories were kind of an avenue for me to learn how to use the facility as a whole. So that's where a lot of this information came from. And I think, you know, there are hundreds and hundreds of fascinating cases that took place in Butte that you can research. I just chose today 6. And so we'll go over these in this order. They're not exactly in chronological order, but kind of, you know, least offensive, least violent to most violent, maybe is the way it's kind of organized. So we'll start out up in Walkerville, and this was kind of an interesting case where a lady had sent an obscene letter through the mail, God forbid, and she was arrested for that, and so we'll go over that case. And then there's this really interesting figure that it's really difficult to find a lot of information about other than newspaper articles, named Cowboy Pearl. And she was kind of interesting, and that was a cool name, I thought. And so we'll look into her. And then Michael Drozda was the victim of a car bomb down on Paxson here in Butte in 1975. Wow. So we'll talk about that one a little bit. James Sullivan, along with Thomas Manning, I believe is his name, was killed on the Anaconda Road, you know, in the Anaconda Road massacre. And I had never really heard a lot about him. He didn't die the same day or a couple days later like Manning did, but he died like 5 months later from a bullet in his spine, and so we'll talk about that. And that, I think, is a good incident to really demonstrate just how the different newspapers of the day had different biases, something that we luckily don't have to deal with anymore. It's back, sorry. And then we'll cover David Lee Landrum, which was kind of an interesting case, homicide, robbery. It took place just outside of Butte, Somerville County, down by the Divide interchange, but it was, I thought, close enough to Butte to count. And then Alexander Nadimovich was charged with murder in 1952 for the murder of this woman, Ellen Brooks. And that took place just below Miller's Boots and Shoes. The house is no longer there. So we'll go, that's a pretty interesting case. We'll go over that one. So I'll just jump in. So first I just had a note about newspapers. And it's kind of debatable, I think, in the world of archives, whether newspapers are a primary or secondary source. You know, a primary source, typically things like diaries or, you know, government records, coroner's reports, documents that are contemporary with the event that were generated by individuals or entities close to the event. So I think pretty much the consensus is that newspapers are not a primary source, although, again, it's somewhat debatable. And these two headlines, which I'll cover again later in the presentation, kind of demonstrate the different bias that comes across. So the Butte Daily Bulletin says, you know, ACM gunmen shoot down miners in cold blood, whereas the sheriff is saying that the miners started it, and it's a revolution. It was just a different reporting on the same event can be, you know, night and day. Something we're all familiar with, I think. So that's just a little bit about newspapers, and you know, I'm obviously not the first person to do research with newspapers in Butte, and but I found that when working here was a really common thing that we all turn to at some point in the research process just to find more information or find leads, or again find little tidbits that can point us to primary source materials that we hold at the archives. And I don't typically do like an endorsement or a sales pitch for a subscription service, but newspapers.com is absolutely incredible. So highly recommend it if you haven't used it. And it's very easy to use, and that was kind of my original intention with this presentation, was to do an instructive thing about how to use newspapers.com that the staff here can show you, and it's really easy to navigate, and you can just be amazed at what you can find. You know, I think at this point there's like 120 million pages scanned. Wow. And they have optical character recognition, so you can search by term for newspapers all over the world, going back centuries. So it's just unparalleled, really. It's an amazing tool. And so when I was working here, you know, we'd use it to find photos of people's family members that they'd never seen before, or genealogical information, or again, those leads that bring you to the really interesting primary source stuff that's here in the archives. But again, I'm not the only one to use newspapers to do research. Suzanne Stefanik did a radio show for some time on KBMF here called 100 Years Ago in Butte, and in fact did a brown bag on that in June 2019, which you can find on the YouTube channel. And I have an episode that I wanted to play that she did all about youth crime, which was really fun. I think it's going to play through the projector speaker, so it might be a little quiet. We'll see if it's audible, I'll let it roll. If not, we'll move on. So
you can lean forward and see if your mic will pick it up.
Well, it's going to play from I get on the ladder and hold my mic there. Let's see. So here's the...
Welcome to 100 Years Ago in Butte, as told through newspaper articles of the day. News reports suggest Butte police were often kept busy chasing youthful offenders. Young night owls sought probation officer J.J. McCarthy to prosecute girls and boys who violate city ordinance by keeping late hours. Officer McCarthy yesterday announced the beginning of an unceasing war against young persons who violate the city curfew ordinance. During the past 2 days, police officers have taken into custody 30 young persons who have been found on the streets after 8 o'clock in the evening. Sent immediately upon arrest to the industrial school. Similar action is to be taken against those boys and girls 17 years old and younger who frequent public dance halls. It is the intention of Mr. McCarthy to put an end to the trouble that many of those who frequent these halls have given.
Pretty hard-hitting crimes there. Kids out past 8. But Suzanne has maybe a couple hundred episodes of that show, and they'll soon be available on the KBMF website. And so I encourage you to check those out if you're interested in more newspaper-centric Butte research. So yeah, we'll jump into it here, some true crime stuff here in Butte. So, okay, the Walkerville scandal. Yes, it's very exciting. So the facts of this case, Cassie French is the person in question. And her and her husband John were married and moved to Walkerville around 1884, as far as I could tell. And then she was arrested in June of 1898 for writing a letter to this guy, James McFadden. It's not really clear what their relationship was. In court, James McFadden said, well, Cassie said that James had asked her to write this letter to him. He denied that. So then she was arrested. She had a $500 bond. And during the court proceedings, the postmaster read the letter aloud in court. And I, in one of those rare moments where I had spare time, I called the district court here to see if there was any record of this letter on hand, because we don't have it in our files here. And unfortunately, I couldn't put my hands on this letter, but I'm very curious to see what it might have said that made it so obscene. And so she ends up escaping with a light fine, but it's never, again, really clear what exactly the relationship between her and this James McFadden was. But he ended up going to Alaska where he had a mining claim, and then came back to Butte and had like a week-long party basically, and then him and his business partner with their riches from the mining in Alaska went to Ireland. And then he's never really heard from again, and there's not a lot about the Frenches after that in the paper either. But I thought it was kind of an interesting tidbit, obscene letter. I really wanted to read what this letter was to see really just how obscene it might have been. But
it kind of begs the question, like, how did they know?
Yeah, I think
did McFadden bring it to them?
Well, I think what had happened was the postmaster had read the letter, because when she went to the post office, she asked the postmaster, "Can you send a handwritten letter in pencil?" And he was like, "Yeah, I think so." And he opened it up, to look at it, and it was like, "Oh my God!" And then she was arrested by the U.S. Marshals. So it seems like it might be a First Amendment violation. I don't know. But that was kind of a fun one. Now we can get into the really juicy stuff, though. But so Cowboy Pearl, case number 2. So born approximately 1880, don't know where, couldn't figure that out. Lived in Butte, Anaconda until around 1900, but in 1903 was in North Dakota. This is the first time I found her mentioned in a newspaper here, and it said, "Even if she's sober, she oughtn't to visit saloons." So Pearl, Cowboy Pearl, was fined for disorderly conduct, and a saloon is no place for a woman, although the evidence is not conclusive that you were drunk. If you're here again under the same circumstances, I shall feel I ought to impose a fine. So I'm not quite sure what's going on or how she's being disorderly. Anyway, so she had moved to North Dakota by 1903, and she was in Havre for a little bit too. There's record over there. And then she was working in the red light district in Williston and killed a guy, shot him in the forehead, Charles Striegel, and that was in 1903, and she ended up doing 5 years in North Dakota prison for that murder. And so you can see here the various newspaper coverage of it. This is the Anaconda Standard, Butte Daily Post, the Great Falls Tribune, killed in the red light, a denizen of the Tenderloin, shoots a married man, but he was no good anyway.
That's why she only got 5.
I like this one too. Woman who used gun is known as Pearl Brown and is a familiar character around Havre and Chinook. Dead man, her lover. Charles Striegel was instantly killed by Pearl Brown, a sporting woman.
Oh.
So she shot him, shot Charles Striegel, killed him, was convicted of the murder. And in this article it says here he'd been a worthless character for years and was held for before. And so the reporting at the time was hysterical sometimes. I mean, maybe it's not a laughing matter, I don't know. So she did 5 years. Like I say, girl guilty of murder, convicted at Williston. And again, she was working in the red light district there. And after that, there's not a lot of mention of her until 1910. She's out of prison, she's back in Butte and in the news briefly. And here you can see, it's basically every decade Pearl is in the newspaper for drunkenness. And so she's taken in by the complaint that these men came to her crib and drew a knife on her. They denied the accusation. They carried no weapons, had little money. She was held as a witness, even though she's alleging that people came to her crib with a knife. And so then another incident in August of 1910, she breaks a pitcher over this guy's head. Winch from restricted district is accused of second-degree assault. It's not a very sympathetic portrayal of poor Cowboy Pearl. What I really love about these is just, all the things you could imagine that this person's life was like in between the brief mentions you see of them in the newspaper. And I really I wish I could have found more about her or met her or just hear, because she obviously had kind of a difficult go. And working in the red light district from a really young age, and numerous assaults, and I'm inclined to believe that it was out of self-defense, a lot of these things, but the newspaper obviously was not that sympathetic. And so then the last time really that I found mention of her, this one's kind of a funny story where these arrested twice in one day, and so basically they were out partying at this cabin. And the people who lived nearby or next door got annoyed So the police came and arrested them for drunkenness. They were released and went back out there the same day. Whereupon it is alleged they went back to the place and created more excitement and were again arrested. So that must have been a fun day in June of 1921. And then the last real mention of her that I could find, this comes from the Anaconda Standard, 1924. So 5 alleged vagrants and 2 men were charged with drunkenness. They forfeited bond. They were Pearl Brown and a bunch of other folks. And,
some of those names or something. Lucy.
Yeah, Lucy Luce. Yeah. Jackie Dempsey and Jack Queen were there too. So she undoubtedly had a hard and very interesting life and was prone to drink. But that's about all I could find about Cowboy Pearl. I just thought that was such a unique name. So that's our second case. Okay, now we're getting into the real deal. Okay, so the Drozda bombings, the first time I heard about this, Aubrey and I undertook this project to redo a lot of the coroner's records here at the archives, just the way that they were organized on the shelves in the vault, and consolidated some files. And anyway, in doing that, I came across this folder, and it just says Drozda bombing. And I had never heard of that before and was curious about it. And in this folder is a really brief coroner's report, and I'll show you a more detailed coroner's inquest in a moment. But the facts of this case, so Michael Drozda was an underground miner, and in 1975, when he was murdered, he was working as a mailman. So on September 9th, 1975, he was killed when a car bomb exploded in his truck on Paxson, and that's a picture there of the truck exploded and off the road. It's not far from where his house was. And so right away, within like 48 hours, there was an 8-person federal bomb squad that flew into Butte along with a postal inspector and led the investigation. And it didn't really take that long for this crazy motive to come out from one of his acquaintances who would eventually be convicted of the crime. And the team eventually identified him as the bomber. Sometimes when you read these newspaper articles and you go through the primary source material, especially if you read the coroner's inquest yourself, I feel like a juror almost, like I can make my own determination about what I think happened. And this is one where I really do think they got the guy who did it. That's my opinion. So just based on the materials that I've read. So initially they were thinking maybe it was a professional hit on this mailman, but that proved to really not be a viable lead or anything, or an idea. And so, yeah, like I say, the feds showed up to probe the bombing, and not too long after that they started questioning this guy, and then charged him. So Lawrence McLean was arrested in September 1975, not long after the incident. And this really is what emerged as the motive. He felt he didn't get a correct share of deer meat. And they had been hunting buddies, and they also would go camping together and stuff like that. And so if you read the newspaper articles, there was another incident where McLean felt that Drozda had stolen his wallet with $125 in it, and it kind of blocked him out of his life after that. Like their friendship was fractured over this stolen wallet accusation. And then McLean later found his wallet at his house. So, of course, Drozda didn't steal his wallet, but this guy seems to have kind of held a grudge about that. And then this whole deer meat thing came up, and I guess he decided I'll build a car bomb after that. And so if you read newspaper reports of the time, it kind of tracks the trial week in, week out, and he's arrested in September, and then the trial drags on into the summer of 1976. And it's interesting, I think there is a little bit of room for some empathy for this guy McLean, because the way he's described in the newspaper, didn't have a lot of friends, didn't overtly deny the bombing, but if you read the newspaper report on it, the sheriff's interviewing him, interrogating him, and he says, well, if I did it, I must have done it in my sleep because I don't remember. It's like, God, why would you say that?
Yeah.
And so McLean had worked at the Berkeley pit, and he had access and knowledge of how to use the type of explosive that was used in the car bomb, which was this PDTN. And he also had knowledge of wiring, and so they said that the blasting caps that were found in his garage were identical to the one in the bomb, which they presume he took from work when he was working at the pit, and maybe just had him around the house, or maybe he had planned to do this bombing for some time. That part's kind of unclear. And so here, these were the things that introduced like a little bit of reasonable doubt into the case, which I guess is the job of the defense attorney. And so when they were cross-examining the postal inspector and the deputy sheriff, they acknowledged that basically they had left the crime scene unprotected for several nights.
Oh, geez.
And so the argument by the defense attorney at the time was that someone could have come by and, you know, dropped off pieces of a blasting cap that they knew McLean had, or somehow framed him, or otherwise contaminated the crime scene. And so they also, when they were initially interviewing McLean, interrogating him, I should say, they believed he understood the form he signed during questioning, but stopped the interrogation when he didn't know what the word waiver meant. And so you wonder, well, did the sheriff kind of browbeat this guy into admitting to a crime that he really didn't do? Or, but then as the trial wore on and the evidence kind of added up, the jurors got to hear a very detailed description of the construction of the bomb, which they said was circular, about 2 inches thick, and it's made of this PTM, the same stuff they used at the Berkeley Pet at the time. And the shape charge was attached to the bottom of the truck with 2 big bar magnets, fragments of which were found in the truck and in Drozda's body. And then they pinpointed the manufacturing date of the DuPont blasting cap between these dates here, and again, those were blasting caps that were used at the mine. And so then I thought maybe the most damning aspect of it was that in his garage, apparently, he had this box, cardboard box with some auto parts in it, and a piece of that had been torn off, and pieces of that very similar looking cardboard box were wrapped around the bottom, and fragments of that were everywhere at the crime scene too. So it kind of seemed like he just built this bomb and ripped a piece of cardboard off a box and wrapped it around it and stuck it on the car. And I don't know, eventually he was convicted, found guilty of the bombing death, and they had introduced over 400 pounds of evidence. And he was also described by the prosecutors as a pack rat with knowledge of explosives and electrical wiring. So it seemed like a pretty clear-cut case the more I looked into it. It's probably worth omitting, but we could pass this around, or you can come up afterwards if you like and look. But the coroner's report at the time, which is just the initial write-up by Leo Jacobson, who was then coroner, really details what he found upon arriving at the scene. And so if you're interested in some very disturbing medical terminology, that document is sitting here. But I think I'll forego really reading the details that the coroner put forth. So he's sentenced to 100 years for this murder, and is off to Deer Lodge in June of 1976, and within 5 years he's dead.
Wow.
Died in prison, well, at Galen. So that's the story of the Drozda bombing, and again, I'm covering 6 cases. We could probably do an entire presentation just on one of these, because there's so much information and so many primary source documents that we have here at the archives on these cases. And it's always kind of nerve-wracking to talk about Butte to a crowd at a brown bag. Undoubtedly, someone here knows more than I do on no matter the subject. And so there will be a time for questions or comments at the end, and I'd love to talk about it if folks know about these cases. In fact, my friend Mike Boyce's father was partners with Michael Drozda when they worked underground together. So he was telling me a little bit about it too. But it's kind of a tragic deal and a sad end on all accounts. Okay, so moving on, we're kind of going back in time now. So, talking about April 21st, 1920, striking miners on the Anaconda Road. There's a lot of, literature out there about this incident, and I guess it's never really been clear who fired the first shot, but depends on who you ask. But basically, according to the Butte Daily Bulletin, the company had hired all these, Pinkertons and hired guns, and they wanted to disperse the crowd, so they just started shooting into the crowd of the unarmed striking miners, and killing Thomas Manning, and as I said, I learned killing this gentleman too, James Sullivan. So known as Jimmy, he worked in the Coeur d'Alene mining district, also worked in Butte, shot in the spine on Anaconda Road, April 21st, 1920. He was eventually shipped back basically to Ireland. He was crippled, and he died at his parents' home December 7th, 1920. So he lingered for some months, and I'm sure it was painful. And along with Thomas Manning is one of two who died from gunfire on the Anaconda Road that day. And I again have an audio piece. Do you think it's were you able to kind of hear the last one? Okay, so this is from Dick Gibson's Verdigris Project series, Butte, America's Story, and where he talks about the Anaconda Road Massacre. So I'll play that. I think it's about 3 minutes.
Welcome to Butte, America's Story. I am your host, Dick Gibson. 1920 marked a precipitous decline, in fact the abrupt end of the labor movement that had been at the forefront of Butte news since 1914. On April 21st, 1920, striking miners were marching on the Anaconda Road, the primary artery that served the big mines on the hill. The Anaconda, Never Sweat, St. Lawrence, Pennsylvania, and Mountain View each employed 400 to 600 men per shift in their heyday, and every day at shift change, thousands of men would pour down the Anaconda Road to its junction with Wyoming and Copper Streets to fan out to saloons, bars, boarding houses, restaurants, churches, and homes. The Anaconda Road also followed the lower reaches of Delton Gulch on the eastern edge of Corktown and was lined by miners' cottages and boarding houses full of Irishmen. The 1920 strike, fomented by the Radical Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, was apparently the last straw for the Anaconda Company. Armed gunmen came out from the Never Sweat mine and began shooting into the mob of unarmed miners. At least that's the likely story. The full truth will probably never be known. Something like 15 miners were shot, all of them in the back, as they ran down the hill, and 2 were killed. The event became known as the Anaconda Road Massacre, and it spelled the end of labor union activism in Butte for the next 15 or more years. The best known of the dead was Tom Manning, a 25-year-old Irish immigrant who lived at the 2-story boarding house at 20 West Courts, the Montana Standard parking lot today. He had intended to bring his wife and infant son to Butte from Ireland that fall, since he had nearly saved enough money after 3 years of mining to do so. But he never got the chance. He lingered for nearly 4 days, but died on April 25th as federal troops arrived in Butte to occupy the city and put down rebellious strikers. The troops stayed at the Florence Hotel on East Broadway, while Tom Manning lay in state at Tom Scanlon's house at 316 North Idaho, now a vacant lot. Scanlon was an IWW sympathizer, but sympathy for Manning went beyond the radical union. Thousands came to Scanlon's house to pay their respects, and something like 3,000 followed Manning's casket from St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Church down to Holy Cross Cemetery. In the wake of the Anaconda Road Massacre, union activism in Butte was quieted by the Anaconda Company's control, but union voices were not stilled. Ralph Chaplin, poet of the IWW, characterized it this way: "The overlords of Butte will not permit their right to exploit to be challenged. Drunk with unbridled power and the countless millions profiteered during the war, with lying phrases of law and order on their lips, the blood of working men dripping from their hands, and the gold of the government bursting their coffers, they face the nation unreprimanded and unashamed, reaction militant, capitalism at its worst. The Copper Trust can murder its slaves in broad daylight on any occasion and under any pretext. There is no law to call a halt. In the confines of this greed-ruled city, the government has replaced the Constitution. Butte is a law unto itself." Strong words for a challenging time.
Indeed. And I guess you could file that one under unsolved murders. Turn on my. Okay. Yeah, that would be, I would say, an unsolved murder. No one was ever charged with those killings, and no one really ever was able to determine, I guess, who pulled the trigger. So, and again, it kind of brings us back to the different perspectives the newspapers of the day had on the incident. So, depending on your source, you might think it went one way or another. So that's James Sullivan.
Clark?
Yes.
Can I add something? If you
Yeah.
go back a little bit. Notice the top headline comes from the Butte Daily Bulletin, which was a pro-labor newspaper that was published for a very short time, and it grew out of the 1917 strikes and things like that. A lot of labor issues in the late teens. So you get that perspective versus the Butte Miner, which is seen more of a corporate. And that's where your primary source is the voice becomes the source.
Right. Yes. Yeah, the Butte Daily Bulletin's got a lot of really cool headlines. Okay, so I got two more cases to cover. Another murder case. This one is the one that I mentioned that took place down on the Divide interchange, so just outside of Butte County, and it was prosecuted in Beaverhead County. So a body was found on the side of the highway, just beyond that interchange, February of 1979, shot in the head and dumped on the side of the road. One thing that kind of fascinates me, when the police are able to solve a homicide, it seems to come really quick. And it just took them 4 days to arrest this guy, David Lee Landrum, who was eventually charged with the murder. And they arrested him in Mexico 4 days later. And the victim was Robert W. Johnson of Yuma, Arizona, and he was an acquaintance of Landrum's. And so if you read through the newspaper articles at the time, again, this is 1979, they had become friends down in Yuma and decided to go on a road trip. And so they ended up down there outside of Divide, and I don't quite know what went wrong, but that's when Landrum shot Johnson, stole his truck, drove it to Butte, dumped it at the Safeway parking lot, and then using money that he had robbed from his friend on the road trip, took a flight back to Mexico. So that was his grand plan, I guess. And let's see here, yep, and I just went over that. Those are those things. So then, this is June of 1979. The murder took place in February, so he's been held in Beaverhead County Jail for that period of time when he escapes. This guy has kind of an interesting story, and it's not simply like he did the crime, he was caught, convicted, and then died in jail, although all those things are true. He kind of had this tale that went on and on and on that was really interesting to follow over the years. So as he's awaiting trial down in Dillon, he escapes jail with, he's the accused murderer, and then the guy he escaped with was an accused rapist. And they were caught not too long after, 3 days later, and someone saw David Lee Landrum walking down by a railroad track, and the cops came and got him pretty much without incident. And then, so it would have been almost 2 years later, so 1981, he was finally convicted of murder and robbery and sentenced to 70 years. So I think it was 40 for murder and 30 years for robbery. And then he was transferred to the New Mexico State Penitentiary later in 1981 to be closer to his family, who were partially in Mexico and also in Arizona. And so then he's down there in prison in New Mexico. He gets in a fight with some other inmates in the prison and is transferred to a hospital temporarily. And then he escapes again. So this time, I think the way it went was the nurse had asked him to, like stand behind the curtain so he could change into the hospital garb. And while he was behind this closed curtain, he grabbed a bunch of bed sheets and tied them together to a rope real quick and went out the window of the third floor. So this time he wasn't gone very long either. You can see here they tell him to lie down, and he did. They searched him, handcuffed him, took him back to the prison. And so then he's escaped twice, but now he's back in prison in 1983. So then, 1985, this is from the Madisonian, which is an interesting little small newspaper. David Landrum, convicted of deliberate homicide in Dillon in 1979, has written a book, exclamation point. And so apparently he wrote this book called Sonora Sunrise. And he sent an autographed copy to Under Sheriff Mark During and the clerk of the court at the time, Irene. And so I called this district court to see if there's any chance that Irene still worked there. She's long since retired. And then this gentleman, Mark During, had also retired, but only like in 2006. And apparently he moved to Las Vegas and no one had a phone number, and I couldn't contact him to see, what'd you think of the book? because it says here they have been assigned to read and review the literary effort. You're really curious to see what this Sonora Sunrise is all about. So that was kind of an interesting little turn. And then in 1985, he's back in Deer Lodge. I think after the escape attempt, he was eventually transferred from the New Mexico State Penitentiary back to Deer Lodge. And so him and a couple other folks had filed cases, federal cases, against the chaplain and the warden out at Deer Lodge Prison. And Landrum had said that he had converted to Rinzai Zen Buddhism, and the study of comparative religions has enlightened my total religious life. And basically the prison officials, the chaplain and everything, were denying him these materials, reading materials, cassette tapes, and so he thought that was a violation of his rights, and so he sued in federal court. He also said that he was attacked by other inmates, hit with a chair, which was observed by guards who didn't intervene. He had water, food, and urine thrown on him and routinely received verbal threats of death. And so he was not having a good time in prison, and he sued. And I thought this was an example, you know, the really old newspapers, you kind of get it when the language is kind of flowery and lurid. But this one I thought was really a jab at him. Killer claims life in danger. Kind of like making fun of the guy, I feel like. And so he's in Deer Lodge, and he says that prison officials there had asked him to make statements against other inmates which would endanger his life. And this is September 28, 1985. And this is the last mention you hear of David Lee Landrum in the newspapers. And I did call the Montana State Prison Records Office and inquired about David Lee Landrum, and all they could tell me was that he was deceased, but they didn't cite a cause or tell me when. And so, you know, he's warning that people are asking him to squeal and it's going to get him killed, and then you never hear from him again. So you got to wonder what happened to David Lee Landrum. Another interesting story. Okay, for our final case, this one was probably the one that occupied the most time when I started looking into these true crime cases in Butte. I should say case number 6 there, not 5. So this is a really sad story, and it's one of those ones that really just makes you wish things had turned out differently. And so in 1952, February 20th, as often seems to happen in Butte, it was a very, very cold night in February. It was like -30 degrees. And Ellen Brooks and her family operated the secondhand store at 311 and a half South Arizona, which again is the parking lot south of Miller's Boots and Shoes today. So they operated the secondhand store, and basically her husband would do like tailoring and repairs of clothing and shoes and stuff like that, and they sold knickknacks and whatnot. And so this frigid February night, 1952, there's a knock at the door, and her husband is sick in bed, and her son is asleep in another bed, and he's in his mid-20s, and I think he had just been discharged from the military. And she answers the door and is suddenly bludgeoned over the head with some kind of object and falls out the front door into the snow. And so then her son, hearing this, is startled and gets out of bed, and he goes to the door and he sees his mother laying there bleeding, and there's this guy standing over her holding something, which he later said may have been a rock or like a brick, some kind of blunt object. And then the guy takes off running. And so the son is pursuing him, but he's barefoot and just in long johns, and again it's like -30. And so he's chasing this guy, and this is the scene, the door where she was bludgeoned, and again February 1952. So here I got a little map, and there's Miller's down there, and so that's where the assault takes place. And so as the son pursues this guy out the door of the house, they run up Arizona Street and turn the corner, and right here apparently there used to be a gas station, and the son is looking for this guy, and he hollers at him to come out, and the guy comes out from hiding and runs across the street, but they get into a fight right here. And so the son actually has a hold of this guy, and he's pummeling him on the ground. They're fighting and rolling around in the snow, and the guy somehow slips loose and starts running up Wyoming. And then here at the corner of Wyoming and Galena, the son catches up with him again. and is punching him and hitting him, and they're biting each other and pulling hair, and it's this terrible fight. But the son is, by this point, his feet are just frozen, and he's just out of bed, and he's in his underwear, and he's screaming and yelling for people to help, but no one will respond because they just figure it's a couple of drunks fighting. And it must have just been so infuriating to not be able to hold on to this guy. And anyway, so he loses him here at this corner and chases him a little bit further, but the assailant runs west on Galena, up Dakota, and then down Park. And then he lost them, so he goes back to the house, and then the police come, and then the rest of the case ensues. And so eventually they find this guy, Alexander Nadimovic, and they charge him with murder. And if you read through the coroner's inquest at the time, which, I don't think I really said it, I was not familiar with coroner's inquests when I first started working here, but there are these fascinating documents where the coroner interviews everyone involved with the case. And typically it occurs, before a charge will take place. So it really paints a picture of the scene, of what people were feeling, what they were thinking, what they remember. And so if you read through the coroner's inquest on this case, basically it paints a picture of this guy as this disaffected youth who is a minor, and he is an alcoholic. And that night he was out drinking, and I think he went to 7 different bars in the vicinity of the Brooks household. And he had a conflict with the Brooks husband over a coat that he had brought to their secondhand store to be repaired. So a couple weeks previous to this incident, he had brought this coat in that had a torn pocket that he tore while he was out drinking, and brought it to get repaired, and then they had some disagreement over the price, so what it would cost to get the coat back, and he cussed the guy out and then left, and they thought that was that. So basically the way the case went was the prosecution, so they thought that over this nothing conflict over a jacket, he was all drunk and realized, oh, those guys live just down the street, I'll just go give them a piece of my mind. And so then when Mrs. Brooks opened the door, he hit her instead of maybe his intended target of the father. But the coroner's inquest is really fascinating when you read this guy's, the night that he had that night, because he had a teenage wife at the time, and he basically went to a payday loan place and got a $12 or $15 loan, and then went out drinking all night on this loan. And I pulled out the coroner's inquest for this case, just to kind of show you. And so there are 2 of these in this file, and it's a pretty thick file. And here they're interviewing a guy who is a janitor that was acquainted with Nadimovic. And he said, did you know him before? Yes, just when he was passing by, he used to stop and talk. Where was that? Oh, at the liquor store. How long have you been talking to him? They go on and on. So how long were you in there? About 10 minutes. I just drank a soda. Was he, Alexander, intoxicated? He was feeling good, not too drunk. What did he drink? I had a soda. He had a beer. It's very detailed, and so you get this very clear picture of what this guy was up to that night. So of course they arrest him, they put him in jail, and he escapes. There's always an escape. So basically what he did, he's sitting in the Butte County Jail, and the jailer comes by. He has a glass of water, he throws it in the guy's face, and then he breaks out of jail. And he had convinced this other kid to join him. So they were on the run for 3 days until they found him a couple miles north of Meterville. I really liked this picture. This kid, Zadwarny, who was arrested with him for the escape, really is staring at this Tommy gun. So there he is back in custody. And so you have a guy who seemingly had some shred of a motive, was at the scene of the crime or near it the night of the crime, is arrested, then escapes, and is reapprehended. And so the trial goes on. We're into October of 1952 at this point. He denies it vehemently the whole time. Another thing that's worth mentioning is that the son, of course, who got a really good look at this guy as he was fighting him multiple times in the street, swears up and down as soon as he lays eyes on this guy that it's him. This is definitely the guy that I fought that night, is what he says. Also, he had torn off a piece of his jacket, which was this blue overcoat, and Nadimovic had a torn blue jacket. And it just seemed like it was all adding up, for sure. And of course, they acquitted him. And so this is another one that would go under, you know, unsolved murders in Butte history. The really frustrating thing about this is there was never really a chance for any appeal, because just 3 years later, he moved to California and died in a car accident. And so then it's like, case closed. You never really, will never know who killed Elliot Brooks so senselessly and brutally. And I think about this case every time I'm driving now down by Miller's Boots and Shoes. You know, look over at the parking lot and just think about the crazy. Who knows how many hundreds of crazy incidents such as this have played out in the streets of Butte that we just never know about. Just as a final note too, there was an article in 1960 with this headline, 5 local murders in the last 6 years still listed as unsolved. So it's not entirely uncommon, of course, that unsolved murders happen. You just don't, I don't think about it happening in Butte, but it's been happening a long time. And there are some really interesting judicial or district court records on this guy, Alexander Dimavec, here at the archives too. And I didn't pull out for this presentation, but you know, the staff here can help find them if anybody's curious or wants to look more into it. There's lots of really interesting documentation about this case. And again, I kind of came away with my own opinion just thinking for sure this guy did it. And for whatever reason was acquitted and then died in that car crash. So here's some of the sources I used, all the various newspapers and then archives collections. There are other research that I could just think of off the top of my head that pulls from newspapers. I have to give a shout out to Verdigris Project, Butte American Story. We heard about that from Dick Gibson. Heart Without the Crown, another KVMF production by our very own John Conlon, right there. And 100 Years Ago in Butte, and then of course, numerous publications for sale in the archives. I welcome any questions or comments.
Wow.
Great.